Here's an interesting fact about sheep. Sheep can recognize individual faces, both human and ovine, and that is goats, antelope, bison, buffalo, and cows, and they can remember faces for years. In addition to long-term facial recognition of individuals, sheep can also perceive and differentiate emotional states through facial characteristics. If you frown at a sheep, they will run away. And if you smile at a sheep, you have a good chance of, like little Mary, becoming their shepherd. This is perhaps my favorite fact about sheep. If you work with a sheep patiently for a long enough time, over time, sheep will learn their own names. Although all of the sheep information has rather recently been documented and written about in books, 2,000 years ago, before people lived in this information-rich society such as the one we live in, the writer of the Gospel of John already knew about sheep. Maybe because he himself was a shepherd. He certainly lived in a society that prized sheep as a valuable commodity, used both for food and for clothing. Commensurate with their value, sheep were kept in a pen right outside the house. That's how valuable they were. There was only one gate to the sheep pen, and if the householder was especially prosperous, he could afford to hire a gatekeeper to monitor and supervise entry through that gate to the sheep. Knowing all of this, John, the beloved disciple, wrote this beautiful allegory in praise of Jesus, the shepherd of the sheep, read by Joan Graves in our hearing today. The pericope that Joan read began by saying, "Anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in another way, is a thief and a bandit." We sheep, you and I, we are God's precious treasure, and if you attempt to get to us by any other way than by the prescribed entrance, you are not following the will of God. Jesus once said, "I am the way, the truth, and the..."
Right.
You can ask the 5 o'clock service why that is especially poignant at some other time. Many people came proclaiming that they were from God, and they had the gospel. They had the good news. But their good news may not have included justice for all, making all welcome around Christ's table, forgiving women at the well, making a place for the differently abled on the road, making a place for eunuchs or a centurion and his beloved slave, loving all of creation just as God created it. Jesus is saying here, anyone who twists the welcome of the gospel for their own purposes and then tries to sneak over a wall to get to us sheep is a robber and a thief, because they are trying to distort our relationship with God and make off with you and I for their purposes. John goes on to write, "The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep." To make sure that only the shepherd enters the sheepfold, Jesus has given the gatekeeper charge over who is to enter and leave the place where his precious flock is left. The gatekeeper will only welcome the shepherd through the gate. Who is the gatekeeper? King David, again and again brought to his knees, humbly writes in Psalm 84, "I would rather be a gatekeeper in the house of the Lord than to dwell in the tents of wickedness." Kingly, human David. So, we humans, in all of our comings and goings, often like David, brought to our knees, are not only the sheep, but we are also the gatekeepers for other sheep. It is our job, through standing at our gate, or in Little White Chapel's case, the door, with our offerings, and at the table with our attitudes, to welcome God's message of love and inclusion as exemplified through the life and teachings of Jesus. We are to welcome that through the gates and rejoice as God's mercy and love gets to the sheep over whom we have been charged to love and protect. I served a church where the adult Bible study class met in the sanctuary before the church. At that church, I was not on the pastoral staff. I was just probably 22 or 23 years old, but I was the organist for the church. And so I had finished working on my prelude, and I was leaving the sanctuary as the Bible study class came in and took its places to have a class. And I was walking by the class one Sunday morning during the time before there was medication that moved AIDS from a death sentence to a chronic livable condition. And I heard the teacher of that adult Sunday school class say this: AIDS was God's retribution for promiscuous sex, and AIDS only affected homosexuals. As I said, I was just passing by, and I was not in the class. And if I were, being such a young man who had been raised to respect his elders, and she was an elder, I doubt if I would have been sophisticated enough at that time to engage in debate with this sadly ill-formed teacher. But watching so many people die, I certainly received and felt the pain of her hurtful words. What pain to inflict on the shepherd's sheep who had come to worship to learn about the law of God. What gatekeeper let that teacher through the gate? Or did she, as a thief and a bandit, sneak over the sheepfold wall? Jesus goes on to say that the gatekeeper opens the gate for the shepherd, and the sheep hear the shepherd's voice. They respond to hearing the shepherd call their name, and it is the shepherd who leads them out. Not follows behind them, but leads them out. Bach is one of my favorite composers, and he wrote a cantata, BWV 208, called Was mir behabt, ist nur der muntere Gott. Bach and librettist Salomon Frank composed this piece. Sheep may safely graze and pasture in a watchful shepherd's sight. The safety comes from the sheep listening for and knowing the shepherd, and in the midst of peace or turmoil, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the shepherd knowing and protecting the sheep. In this day and age, we all seek peace and safety, because it seems in this day and age, you and I are always being hunted. Before we know it, advertisers have stolen over the walls into our presence, cornering us and pressing us to buy items we don't need and can't afford. We are hunted and haunted by the noise of argument, hunted and tormented by our own inner voices sneaking into our safe places, and they are filled with anger and regret and resentment. But like Paul meeting Jesus on the Damascus road, like Cleophas last week meeting Jesus on the Emmaus road, like the two Marys running back on Easter and meeting the risen Christ on the road from Golgotha, on our own roads we have met Jesus, you and I. And Jesus has touched us in such a way that we cannot turn our backs on our brothers and sisters. We are the gatekeepers for brother and sister sheep as we wait for the shepherd. Here's some really good news on our journey. In verse 9, which was just a little bit past where Joan stopped reading, Jesus says, "Pay attention, sheep. Hold your head up, gatekeeper. I am also the gate." So just by being a sheep, watching out for the sheep around you and protecting them with your gifts to BTAC and your gifts to Week of Compassion or Little White Chapel, keeping these doors open for other sheep, or doing whatever else you do for the good of the world, you are not only providing a way for others to experience the all-sufficiency of God, in your caring for others, in your gatekeeping for others, you are going to and through the source yourself. You are worshiping, you are connecting with God, you are experiencing God's all-sufficiency. We are the ones who keep the gate, and all the while the gate is keeping us, protecting. For people of faith, is being protected. What a blessed mystery. Have any of you ever seen the movie Freedom Writers? Before Freedom Writers was a movie, it was a book based on the work of Long Beach, California teacher Erin Ruel. Erin was just a young teacher, and she was assigned to this school. And Erin went in, with her pencils and her notebook and probably her computer, and she was all set to teach these children. And she found she was assigned to some of the lowest performing, bad acting, disrespectful, probably smelly students in the entire school district. They had a lot of demands on them, but they had no one who had broken the code and learned how to minister to them. So this petite little teacher looked at them and took a breath, and she went, so apparently teaching is going to have to take a new attack here. She began by getting them to read Romeo and Juliet. How do you work a bunch of inner city kids through Romeo and Juliet? I don't know, but she did it. And then she got them to see, do you remember the Capulets and the Montagues? The Capulets were Juliet's family, and the Montagues were Romeo's family, and they hated each other. They were powerful, they were prosperous, but they were consumed with hatred for each other. And Erin Ruel got them to see how these two families were exactly like the inner city gangs that people Southern California. Exactly like them. And she got the kids to begin to see themselves in this never-ending antipathy that never abated. She got them to start writing their own stories and got them to start journaling and sharing the journals with other people in the class. And you couldn't critique them. You could only say, I hear that, I understand that, or ask informative questions about it. She got them to start making movies about their experience and showing them to other students in the class. And these young people finally started to understand that they had a voice in the world simply by speaking, simply by finding the words, and rather than acting out, they could do something for their own good and something for the good of society. A huge number of them went to college. After only 3 or 4 years, Erin Ruel got the National Teachers of Distinction Award. And now Freedom Writers is an institution. It is a way, an alternative way, to teach young people all around the country. Erin Ruel wrote this about her experience at that Long Beach school. She said, I have learned that although I am a good teacher, I am a much better student. And I was blessed to learn valuable lessons from my students on a daily basis. Where does teaching stop and learning begin? Where does being cared for others stop and being cared for by the risen Christ begin? There is much insider language in this text from John, much high Christology that is expressly not directed toward living in a world where we coexist in interreligious relationship. This text is hard to explain to Jews. This text is hard for Muslims and Sikhs and Buddhists to hear. It is difficult. But at the same time, we give thanks for this never alone imagery. This I am always with you story as we look out for each other. This text tells us that God, as revealed through Jesus Christ, calls every one of us sheep to be also gatekeepers protecting each other. And at the same time, listening for our shepherd's voice. Rejoicing that we have a plan because he is also the gate, the eye of the needle, the way, the truth, and the life. He is the gate that we come and go into, through, and on from this life, all under Christ's shepherd.